Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about why I do not program the deficit deadlift for novice lifters. And this is a question that came up a while back when I did a video discussing how to use the deficit deadlift to build size and strength, why for a little bit higher volumes of training and sometimes for recovery purposes, combined with additional range of motion, of why the deficit deadlift is a little bit better, and why a lot of more advanced lifters use it, program it, and why I use it. And we get into this big topic of axial loading. That's one of the big factors. When you're a more advanced lifter, you are capable of lifting a lot of weight. And loading weight onto your spine, irrespective an amount of time that your spine is loaded with really heavy weights, irrespective of whether you move it or not, and moving it obviously matters, but irrespective of whether you move it or not, has its own separate recovery component. And it's a systemic recovery component, not just to localize at the muscle level. And so it is easier to hit a wall in your training. It's easier to hit a wall in your recovery when axial loading goes too high. Well, what does this mean for the more novice lifter? I don't think this is a factor. Like you guys notice, I do more box squats than back squats right now because you're forced to use a lighter weight. I do more deficit deadlifts and more speed pulls than normal conventional deadlifts. And it's because it allows me to train with a bit more volume and not run into any recovery issues. But novice lifters aren't strong. And that's what we need to understand. Novice lifters actually do need some compressive force on their spine. I'm still lifting fairly heavy weights, guys. I mean, you've got to remember, like if you watch on one of these, I'm pulling 500 pounds from a 3-inch deficit. All right, I pull up to 500 pounds from a 3-inch deficit right now, which means my max deadlift, if I were to put the same rate of perceived exertion on a regular conventional deadlift, it's obviously going to be more than 500 pounds, right? That's a given. You guys have seen me pull 575 in the last year, conventional, from the floor with my feet on the floor. So we're talking about a significant difference in total axial loading. And that matters, guys. That absolutely matters. Versus someone whose max deadlift is only 250 or 300. Look, if your 5-rep max is 275, let's be realistic here. You're only putting 275 pounds on your spine. The axial loading end of it really isn't that big of a deal. And I'm not saying it doesn't matter, and I'm not saying that people who aren't adapted yet don't have a lower threshold for it, because they do, but you need to be realistic here. Now we get to the other problem. How hard is it to teach most novice lifters to deadlift? I have for my newest novice program, right? My newest novice program, I have a whole video dedicated just to showing you guys how to perform the conventional deadlift. Now, when you watch the average novice deadlift, can they do what I do? Can they replicate it? Usually someone with only 6 weeks of training experience, can they replicate a perfect deadlift without coaching? Almost never. They tend to have hip mobility issues. They tend to have form issues. They have position issues. They don't know how to position their lower back. They tend to have all this back rounding in the lower back because they don't usually have enough body awareness yet with training to even know the difference between their thoracic spine and their lumbar spine when they're rounding them. They can't feel the difference. Very, very few first-year lifters can feel the difference in those areas, right? They can't tell them apart when they're lifting a weight or positioning a weight. You guys see a problem with that when we start adding range of motion to the bottom? Because what's the natural tendency when we start doing deficit deadlifts? You start having to pull the weight even further. You're having to reach further down because your feet are further off the floor. So your hands to get to the bar have to go further down. You're having to bend over more. For someone who doesn't have good deadlift mechanics already, what does that usually mean? That means they just bend over at the lower back. That's what that means. It means they bend over at the lower back. Then what happens? They get more back rounding. They tend to get pulled into bizarre bar paths. And while we can argue about awkward lifting having enormous benefits for building strength, building size, and making you strong, is having to lift weights through awkward positions, such as a safety bar squat, such as a deficit deadlift. All right, these things are hard. They're awkward. Even weighted dips are awkward. All right, there's strength to be gained from doing this. They're difficult. Can't lift as much weight. You really think that's the disadvantaged positions? You think that's the position we need to be putting novice lifters in who are still learning to deadlift? I don't think so. I think what we see when we throw novice lifters who don't even have the proper mobility, they don't have the technique to just do a conventional deadlift perfect yet, you start putting the bar further down and they have to bend over even further. We're going to see them get pulled over. We're going to see them get pulled forward, which is going to dramatically reduce the weight they could do on a deficit deadlift, even relative to their strength. Like if they had learned to deadlift and just had the motor pattern down with the same muscle and same strength, they'd probably be deficit deadlifting a lot more. The deficit deadlift is also a training tool for teaching you to learn to get tighter in the bottom. Well, they don't know how to get tight at the bottom yet. They're just going to roll over. They're going to get pulled further forward, have to be forced to lift a lighter weight. They're going to use way more lower back. And normally, what do? Normally, deficit deadlift, you get more hamstring and stuff involved, right? You get a little more trap, middle trap, hamstrings, quads get worked a hair harder on a deficit deadlift because you're putting things through a further range of motion, right? Your torso has to bend over slightly more, so it puts the traps at a more disadvantaged angle for staying retracted. So there are more stresses put on them, more stresses put on the hamstrings and knees due to having to squat a hair lower to get the right leverages. What happens when you take a novice who still doesn't know how to deadlift correctly? The lower back takes all the extra load, all of it. And then they start developing worse habits. And that's unfortunate, in which you find that sometimes there are some novice lifters who can't even deadlift from the floor. They have to do a below the knee rack pull to even start. They do exist. And that's a valid training tool. They have to pull off of short blocks because they haven't developed the mobility, which is one reason you need to teach them to squat first. All right, a lot of times you need to teach a novice lifter to squat to develop the mobility to deadlift. Sometimes they need several weeks of just squatting and not even being able to pull from the floor. So if they don't usually even have the mobility to deadlift from the floor correctly, which is not uncommon in novice lifters, what happens when you have them do a deficit deadlift? It turns into a nightmare. So teaching them to do it, we're going through twice the work of just teaching the conventional deadlift. No, they can build a base off the conventional deadlift. We just don't do large amounts of volumes for it. That's why usually most good novice programs have people just ramp to one heavy set on the deadlift for novices. You don't have them do sets across. They just get strong. Just learn to lift it heavy for one all-out set. That will put size, it will put strength on a novice lifter with good progressive overload. It's much easier to learn. Teaches them good pulling mechanics. But it doesn't beat them up and it doesn't cause that much exhaustion. While they build their work capacity and they're not lifting such a heavy weight that it really matters. That's the difference of a deficit versus a conventional sometimes is, are we just trying to shave the weight 5 or 10%? Right? Are we trying to shave 10% of the weight off the bar for the same RPE so that we get 10% less axial loading on our really heavy peak sets? When you're weak already, because you're a novice, 10% less on your back isn't really a significant amount. When you're pulling, over 500, or you're pulling 600, or you're pulling 700, 10% is a lot of weight difference. And your reduced deficit deadlift is still usually a pretty monstrous weight. The novice doesn't need to worry about this. They really don't. They don't. The squats and the rows and things like that and chins are going to build most of their back and lower body, and the deadlift is there to fill in the gaps and to teach them to deadlift and to teach them to lift a heavy weight with their entire body and to go ahead and get a little more fatigue in any muscles that might have been missed with the other lifts. All right, novice lifters, in other words, need to stick with the conventional deadlift. And it doesn't matter that the deficit deadlift has awesome benefits for more advanced lifters. It doesn't matter. Even a below the knee rack pull for some more advanced lifters has amazing benefits. But we don't need to have novice lifters be destroying people's power racks and stuff, because that's what they would do if you have them do that. They don't have the training experience to do it correctly, and they end up just damaging equipment and banging their joints up and everything else, right? So when asked why I don't have novices do the deficit deadlift, that's exactly why. They're going to get more mileage and get better use out of a conventional deadlift. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.